What would you trade to save your family? Your name? Your future? Your body? Picture the Forbidden City, 1750. A 16-year-old dragged toward windowless stone, iron doors yawning like a throat. Inside, manhood is currency, and the Dragon Throne demands payment in flesh. Screams become schedules, boys become tools. Before we open those doors, ask yourself, when power puts a price on humanity, who pays and who profits? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Qing Dynasty, ruling China from 1644 to 1912, perfected a system of human modification that would make modern horror writers weep with envy. These weren't random acts of cruelty or battlefield punishments. These were calculated, methodical procedures carried out in specialized facilities designed specifically for the mass production of eunuchs. Men who would serve in the imperial palace, who would tend to the emperor's wives and concubines, who would become living symbols of absolute power's ability to reshape human nature itself, according to its whims. Wang Decheng knew the weight of empty pockets and the gnawing ache of watching his family starve. Born in 1734 in Zili province, he'd worked as a rice farmer before drought destroyed 3 consecutive harvests, leaving his wife and 2 young sons with nothing but debts that multiplied like locusts. The local magistrate offered him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: sell himself to the imperial eunuch system for enough silver to feed his family for 2 years, or watch them die slowly from starvation while he remained powerless to help. Wang's decision, heartbreaking as it was, followed a pattern repeated thousands of times across the empire. Poor families, desperate beyond measure, would sacrifice one son to save the rest. The imperial recruitment system understood this desperation perfectly, targeting the most vulnerable communities with promises of steady employment, regular meals, and the possibility of advancement within the palace hierarchy. What they didn't advertise was the price of admission, paid in the screams that echoed through stone corridors for centuries. The journey to the eunuch prisons began long before Wang reached Beijing. Provincial officials maintained networks of scouts who identified suitable candidates, young men between the ages of 15 and 25, who possessed the physical characteristics deemed appropriate for palace service. They needed to be reasonably attractive, without obvious deformities, and most importantly, they needed to be expendable. Sons from families wealthy enough to protest or influential enough to cause political problems were never selected. This was a harvest that fed exclusively on the desperate and the forgotten. Transportation to Beijing occurred in groups of 20 to 30 men, shackled together in covered wagons that traveled only at night to avoid drawing attention from curious villagers. The journey took weeks, during which the candidates were fed just enough to keep them alive but weak enough to prevent escape attempts. Those who died en route were buried in unmarked graves along the roadside, their names already erased from imperial records that had never officially acknowledged their existence in the first place. Li Mingshan, a former palace guard who kept detailed personal journals throughout his service, documented the arrival process with clinical precision that makes his observations all the more chilling. The wagons would arrive at the Gate of Heavenly Peace just before dawn, he wrote in an entry dated September 15th, 1752. The men inside looked like ghosts already, pale and trembling from weeks of confinement and the growing realization of what awaited them. They were unloaded like livestock, counted and inspected by physicians who examined them, as they might examine horses being considered for purchase. The medical examination that followed was the first step in a process designed to dehumanize the candidates before their actual mutilation began. Stripped naked and forced to stand in long lines, they were prodded, measured, and evaluated according to criteria that had been refined over centuries of practice. Physicians checked for diseases that might make them unsuitable for palace service, but more importantly, they assessed each man's psychological state, identifying those who seemed most likely to survive the coming ordeal and those who might require additional persuasion to cooperate. Dr. Sun Weiming, court physician during the reign of Emperor Qianlong, left medical records that provide disturbing insight into these preliminary examinations. The candidates display various responses to the inspection process. He noted in a report dated March 1758. Some weep openly, others maintain stoic silence, still others attempt to bargain or plead for mercy. We have learned that those who accept their fate most readily tend to survive the operation itself, while those who continue to resist often die from shock or infection in the days that follow. This observation has led us to develop techniques for psychological preparation that improve survival rates significantly. The psychological preparations Sun referenced involved a calculated campaign of terror and false hope designed to break the candidate's will to resist while maintaining their physical health for the operation ahead. They were housed in cramped stone cells beneath the Forbidden City, each containing just enough space for a straw pallet and a chamber pot. Food consisted of thin rice gruel and occasional scraps of vegetables, enough to sustain life but insufficient to maintain strength that might be used for escape attempts. More effective than physical deprivation were the sounds that echoed through these underground chambers day and night. The screams of men undergoing the castration procedure, the sobs of those recovering from surgery, the occasional laughter of guards discussing the day's work over wine and dice games. New arrivals quickly learned that their situation was hopeless, that resistance would only prolong their suffering, and that cooperation offered the only path to survival. Zhou Guangming, who survived the eunuch prison system and eventually rose to become a minor palace official, left one of the few first-hand accounts of life in these preparatory cells. "They kept us in darkness for weeks," he wrote years later, in memoirs discovered in the 1920s. "We could hear everything but see nothing, which made the sounds so much worse." Men would arrive full of fight and fury, swearing they would die before submitting to mutilation. Within days, they were begging for the operation to be performed quickly so their suffering might end. The waiting period served multiple purposes beyond psychological conditioning. It allowed palace physicians to observe the candidates for signs of illness that might not have been apparent during initial examinations. It provided time for administrative processing, the creation of records that would follow each eunuch throughout his service, and the preparation of surgical facilities that operated on strict schedules to maximize efficiency. Most importantly, the waiting period allowed for what officials euphemistically called final consultation, opportunities for candidates to change their minds and accept alternative punishments that might preserve their manhood while still satisfying the imperial justice system. These alternatives, such as exile to remote provinces or assignment to dangerous military campaigns, were presented as acts of mercy that demonstrated the emperor's benevolence toward his subjects. In practice, very few men chose these alternatives once they understood their full implications. Exile meant abandoning families who depended on the silver promised for the eunuch service. Military assignments offered high probability of death without any compensation for surviving relatives. The eunuch system, horrific as it was, at least provided certainty that families would receive payment and that survivors might eventually achieve positions of influence within the palace hierarchy. The surgical facilities where the actual castration procedures took place represented the pinnacle of institutional efficiency applied to human suffering. Located in a separate wing of the prison complex, these chambers were designed specifically for mass processing of candidates with minimal waste of time or resources. Each room contained multiple operating tables arranged in rows, with stations for different phases of the procedure positioned to allow smooth workflow from initial preparation through post-operative care. Master surgeons, men who had performed thousands of castrations and achieved legendary skill in their grisly profession, supervised teams of assistants who handled routine aspects of each operation. The most experienced surgeons could complete a full castration in less than 15 minutes, working with mechanical precision that left little room for error or mercy. Their techniques had been refined over generations, passed down through families who specialized in this particular form of medical practice. The tools of their trade were simple but terrifyingly effective. Sharp knives for making initial incisions, heated irons for cauterizing wounds to prevent excessive bleeding, restraints to immobilize patients during surgery, and various herbal preparations designed to manage pain and reduce the risk of infection. The surgeons maintained their instruments with obsessive care, understanding that their reputation and livelihood depended on achieving consistent results with minimal complications. Anesthesia as we understand it today didn't exist, but the eunuch prison physicians had developed their own methods for managing surgical pain. Patients were given large quantities of alcohol mixed with opium derivatives that dulled sensation without completely eliminating consciousness. They needed to remain awake enough to follow instructions during the procedure, but sufficiently numb to prevent shock that might prove fatal. The actual castration process followed a standardized protocol that had been developed through centuries of experimentation. Patients were restrained on their backs with their legs spread and secured to prevent movement that might cause additional injury. The surgical area was cleaned with hot water and alcohol, then marked to indicate where incisions would be made. The surgeon would work quickly but carefully, removing both testicles and the penis in a single operation that eliminated all external male genitalia. Immediate post-operative care focused on preventing death from blood loss or shock. Wounds were packed with absorbent materials and bandaged tightly to control bleeding. Patients were monitored constantly for signs of complications that might require additional intervention. Those who survived the first 24 hours had reasonable chances of complete recovery, though the psychological trauma would last for the remainder of their lives. Recovery took place in specialized wards where patients received care designed to maximize survival rates while minimizing costs. Food consisted of easily digestible broths and gruels that wouldn't strain healing digestive systems. Medical attention focused on wound care and infection prevention rather than pain management, which was considered a luxury the imperial budget couldn't afford for such large numbers of patients. The mortality rate from castration procedures hovered around 30%, meaning that roughly 1 in 3 men who entered the eunuch prison system died before completing their transformation. These deaths were considered acceptable losses in a system designed to process large numbers of candidates efficiently rather than prioritizing individual welfare. Bodies were disposed of in mass graves outside the city walls, unmarked and unremembered except in the nightmares of those who survived. Those who did survive faced a recovery period that tested human endurance in ways that medieval torture chambers could barely imagine. The newly created eunuchs were housed in what officials called convalescent halls, but which more accurately resembled medical warehouses where human beings were stored like damaged goods awaiting repair. Rows of narrow beds stretched across cavernous rooms, each occupied by a man whose body was healing from wounds that would never truly close, whose mind was grappling with a transformation that had severed him not just from his manhood, but from his very sense of self. The physical healing was only the beginning of a psychological reconstruction that would determine whether these men became valuable palace servants or broken remnants discarded by a system that had no use for the weak. Palace administrators understood that creating functional eunuchs required more than surgical skill. It demanded a comprehensive program of mental conditioning that would reshape their subjects' entire understanding of identity, purpose, and survival. Chen Baoyu, who served as head administrator of the eunuch training program during the 1760s, left detailed records of the psychological techniques employed during this crucial period. The newly castrated men arrive in various states of mental collapse, he wrote in a confidential report to palace officials. Some rage against their fate, others sink into profound melancholy. Still others seem to retreat entirely into themselves. Our task is to channel these responses into useful directions, to transform their trauma into loyalty, their loss into dedication to imperial service. The conditioning process began immediately upon arrival in the recovery wards. Each man was assigned a number that would replace his birth name for the duration of his training. Personal possessions were confiscated and destroyed, severing connections to their former lives. Letters from family members were intercepted and burned, ensuring that the emotional ties that might distract from their new purpose were systematically eliminated. More subtle but equally effective were the daily rituals designed to reinforce their changed status. Morning inspections where they were required to display their surgical wounds to supervisors, ensuring that shame became a constant companion. Afternoon sessions where they practiced feminine mannerisms deemed appropriate for palace service, movements and gestures that emphasized their transformation from men into something else entirely. Evening lectures about the honor of serving the dragon throne, propaganda designed to convince them that their sacrifice had meaning beyond mere survival. The most psychologically devastating aspect of this conditioning was the introduction of competition among the recovering eunuchs. Palace administrators deliberately created hierarchies within the recovery wards, designating some men as supervisors over others, offering small privileges to those who demonstrated proper attitudes while withholding basic comforts from those who showed signs of continued resistance. This system ensured that the eunuchs would police themselves, that peer pressure would accomplish what direct coercion might fail to achieve. Liu Wenhua, whose journal entries provide rare insight into the eunuch experience from a victim's perspective, described the psychological warfare that characterized his recovery period. "They turned us against each other with such skill that we barely noticed it happening," he wrote. Men who had shared the horror of mutilation would suddenly become rivals for an extra bowl of rice or a slightly softer sleeping mat. We learned to watch each other constantly, reporting any sign of defiance or despair that might earn us favor with our supervisors. In fighting for scraps of dignity, we lost what remained of our humanity. Physical training accompanied psychological conditioning as the recovering eunuchs learned skills necessary for palace service. This wasn't the martial arts training associated with imperial guards or the scholarly education provided to future administrators. This was instruction in domestic arts and the countless small tasks that kept the Forbidden City functioning smoothly while remaining invisible to those who held real power. They learned to walk silently on marble floors, to arrange flowers according to seasonal customs, to serve tea with the precise movements that palace etiquette demanded. They studied the complex hierarchy of palace life, memorizing the names and ranks of hundreds of officials, understanding which corridors they could traverse and which were forbidden to eunuchs regardless of their assigned duties. Most importantly, they learned to read the moods and desires of their superiors, developing the psychological sensitivity that would determine their survival in an environment where a moment's inattention could result in brutal punishment or death. The most promising candidates received specialized training for specific roles within the palace structure. Some were taught accounting and record-keeping, skills that would make them valuable as administrative assistants to palace officials. Others learned to read and write in multiple dialects, preparing them for service as interpreters during diplomatic meetings. A select few were trained in more intimate arts, the subtle skills required for personal service to the emperor's wives and concubines. This specialized training revealed the true purpose of the eunuch system, beyond mere castration for palace security. These men were being transformed into living tools, human instruments designed to serve specific functions within the imperial machinery. Their mutilation wasn't punishment, but preparation, a necessary modification that would allow them to operate in spaces where intact men could never be trusted. The graduation ceremony that marked the end of training was both celebration and final humiliation. Successful candidates were presented with new names, identities chosen by palace administrators to reflect their assigned roles and erase whatever remained of their former selves. They received their first palace uniforms, clothing that marked them as neither fully male nor female, but as something uniquely suited to imperial service. Most significantly, they took oaths of loyalty that bound them, not just to the emperor but to the eunuch system itself, promising to recruit and train future candidates with the same dedication they had received. Those who failed to complete training successfully faced fates that made their original castration seem merciful by comparison. Some were sold to private households as domestic servants, their palace training making them valuable to wealthy families who desired eunuchs for their own purposes. Others were assigned to the most dangerous and degrading tasks within the Forbidden City, cleaning sewers, maintaining torture chambers, or serving in roles where their life expectancy could be measured in months rather than years. A few were simply executed, their failure to adapt deemed evidence of inherent weakness that made them unsuitable for any form of useful service. These executions were conducted quietly, without ceremony or record, the failed eunuchs disappearing as completely as if they had never existed. Their bodies were added to the unmarked mass graves that surrounded the capital, joining the thousands of other men who had been consumed by a system that treated human beings as raw materials for imperial ambition. The successful graduates, meanwhile, entered a world that was simultaneously privileged and constrained, where their mutilation had purchased access to power while ensuring they could never truly wield it themselves. They moved through the Forbidden City like ghosts, present at the most intimate moments of imperial life, yet forever excluded from the human experiences that gave those moments meaning. They served emperors and empresses, princes and concubines, handling the most sensitive affairs of state while remaining themselves beyond the reach of normal human connection. Within palace walls, a complex hierarchy emerged among the eunuch population, creating opportunities for advancement that existed nowhere else in Chinese society for men of their backgrounds. Senior eunuchs could accumulate substantial wealth through their positions, managing imperial finances or controlling access to the emperor himself. Some became powerful political figures in their own right, their intimate knowledge of palace affairs making them invaluable advisors and dangerous enemies. Yet this power came with constant awareness of its artificial nature. Every eunuch understood that their influence depended entirely on their usefulness to masters who viewed them as sophisticated tools rather than human beings. Their wealth could be confiscated without warning, their positions eliminated at imperial whim, their lives ended with the same casual brutality that had created them in the first place. They existed in a perpetual state of precarious prosperity, where today's favor could become tomorrow's death sentence. The psychological toll of this existence created its own form of institutionalized madness. Many eunuchs developed elaborate fantasies about their former lives, creating detailed stories about the families they had abandoned and the children they would never father. Others channeled their frustrated masculinity into obsessive pursuit of power, becoming more ruthless than the intact men they served in their desperate attempts to prove their worth despite their mutilation. Some found solace in relationships with other eunuchs, forming emotional bonds that approximated the human connections their condition had severed. These relationships existed in a strange twilight zone between friendship and romance, between genuine affection and mutual recognition of shared trauma. Palace administrators tolerated such connections as long as they didn't interfere with official duties, understanding that completely isolated eunuchs were more likely to become unstable and potentially dangerous. The most disturbing aspect of eunuch society was how completely it normalized its own horror. New arrivals would initially recoil from the casual conversations about castration techniques, the matter-of-fact discussions of which surgeons had the steadiest hands or the lowest mortality rates. Within months, these same men would be participating in such conversations themselves, offering advice to newer candidates about pain management or sharing tips for faster healing. This normalization served a crucial psychological function, allowing the eunuchs to maintain their sanity by treating their shared trauma as simply another aspect of palace life. They developed their own dark humor about their condition, creating jokes and stories that would have horrified outsiders but provided necessary emotional relief for men living with the daily reality of their mutilation. These coping mechanisms transformed victims into participants, making them complicit in the very system that had destroyed them. Jiang Weiguo, who served as a senior palace eunuch for over 30 years, left memoirs that capture this psychological adaptation with chilling clarity. We learned not to think of ourselves as men who had lost something, but as beings who had gained access to a world forbidden to ordinary mortals. The pain of our transformation became a badge of honor, proof that we had paid the ultimate price for imperial service. When I looked at intact men, I no longer envied their completeness but pitied their limitations, their inability to move freely through the spaces where real power resided. The eunuch quarters within the Forbidden City resembled a twisted mirror image of normal society, where traditional gender roles and family structures had been replaced by something altogether more sinister. Senior eunuchs adopted junior ones as surrogate sons, creating pseudo-families bound not by blood, but by shared mutilation and mutual dependence. These relationships provided emotional support while reinforcing the hierarchical structures that kept the system functioning smoothly. Marriage, obviously impossible in any conventional sense, was replaced by elaborate ceremonies where eunuchs would pledge eternal loyalty to one another. These partnerships were recognized informally within the eunuch community and provided some of the emotional stability that traditional marriages might have offered. The couples would share quarters, pool their resources, and care for each other during illness or old age, creating islands of human connection within an ocean of institutional cruelty. Children, The biological impossibility that haunted every eunuch's existence were replaced through adoption of young candidates entering the system. Senior eunuchs would select promising newcomers and guide them through their transformation and training, taking pride in their protege's advancement while living vicariously through their achievements. These mentor relationships created chains of influence and obligation that stretched across generations of eunuch society. The most successful eunuchs learned to weaponize their condition, using their perceived harmlessness to gain access to information and influence that would never have been available to intact men. They became masters of palace intrigue, their enforced celibacy making them appear politically neutral, while their intimate access to imperial family life provided countless opportunities for manipulation and blackmail. Li Fengshan, who rose to become one of Emperor Qianlong's most trusted advisors, exemplified this strategic use of eunuch status. His private papers, discovered during renovations of the Forbidden City in the 1950s, reveal a man who had transformed his mutilation into a tool for accumulating power. "I am trusted because I am seen as incapable of founding a dynasty of my own," he wrote in a coded journal entry dated 1774. What they fail to understand is that power itself has become my offspring, and I nurture it with the same devotion other men show their sons. The economic system surrounding eunuch creation operated on principles that would have impressed modern human traffickers with their efficiency and scale. Provincial officials maintained quotas for eunuch recruitment, with failure to meet these numbers resulting in career consequences that ensured steady supplies of candidates. Local magistrates received bonuses for identifying particularly suitable subjects, creating financial incentives for targeting the most vulnerable populations. Families who sold sons into the eunuch system often found themselves trapped in cycles of debt and dependency that made subsequent sales inevitable. The silver paid for the first son would sustain them temporarily, but economic pressures that had forced the initial decision rarely disappeared. Within a few years, many families would find themselves negotiating the sale of additional sons, each transaction making their situation more desperate and their options more limited. The surgeons who performed castrations operated their own profitable businesses within the imperial system. Master practitioners could command substantial fees for their services, while apprentices worked for reduced rates as they developed their skills on the bodies of men whose lives had no value beyond their utility as training materials. These surgical workshops maintained detailed records of techniques and outcomes, constantly refining their methods to improve survival rates and reduce healing times. Supply chains developed to support every aspect of eunuch production and maintenance. Merchants specialized in providing the herbs and medicines used during castration and recovery. Textile workers created the specialized clothing required for different ranks within the eunuch hierarchy. Food suppliers understood the dietary requirements of men whose bodies had been fundamentally altered, providing nutrition calculated to maintain health while minimizing costs. Even the disposal of surgical waste became a regulated industry. The severed genitalia removed during castration procedures were carefully preserved and cataloged, stored in jars that were maintained throughout each eunuch's lifetime. According to palace regulations, these remains would be buried with their owners upon death, ensuring that they could be whole again in the afterlife. This macabre practice provided some psychological comfort to the mutilated men, while creating another revenue stream for the officials who managed the preservation process. The international dimensions of the eunuch trade extended far beyond China's borders, connecting the Qing system to similar institutions across Asia and the Middle East. Chinese eunuchs were occasionally sold or traded to foreign courts that valued their training and reliability. Foreign eunuchs sometimes found their way into Chinese service, bringing different techniques and perspectives that enrich the overall system while demonstrating its universal appeal to authoritarian regimes. Diplomatic missions often included eunuchs as interpreters and cultural ambassadors, men whose condition made them acceptable to foreign courts that might have viewed intact Chinese men as potential threats. These diplomatic eunuchs became walking advertisements for the superiority of the Chinese system, their refined manners and obvious loyalty impressing foreign rulers who began implementing similar programs in their own territories. The medical knowledge accumulated through centuries of systematic castration found applications far beyond the immediate needs of eunuch production. Chinese physicians developed sophisticated understanding of surgical techniques, infection control, and post-operative care that advanced the general practice of medicine throughout the empire. These advances came at the cost of thousands of mutilated men, but they contributed to medical knowledge that saved countless other lives. Religious and philosophical justifications for the eunuch system evolved over time, creating elaborate theological frameworks that presented systematic mutilation as a form of spiritual purification. Buddhist and Confucian scholars wrote treatises explaining how the elimination of sexual desire freed eunuchs from earthly attachments, making them more suitable for service to the divine emperor. These intellectual justifications provided moral cover for practices that might otherwise have generated popular resistance. Taoist concepts of balance and harmony were twisted to suggest that eunuchs represented a perfect fusion of male and female energies, beings who had transcended ordinary gender limitations to achieve a higher form of existence. This mystical interpretation of castration transformed victims into enlightened beings, at least in the propaganda that justified their continued production and utilization. The artistic and cultural contributions of eunuch society created a distinct aesthetic tradition within Chinese imperial culture. Eunuch artists, freed from the distractions of family life and sexual desire, were said to achieve levels of creativity and refinement impossible for ordinary men. Their paintings, poetry, and musical compositions reflected themes of loss and transformation that resonated throughout Chinese literature for centuries. Eunuch gardens within the Forbidden City became legendary for their beauty and sophistication, designed by men who channeled their frustrated creative energies into landscapes that expressed emotions they could never experience directly. These gardens served as meditation spaces where eunuchs could contemplate their unique position between humanity and transcendence, finding peace in environments that reflected their own hybrid nature. The theatrical performances created and performed by palace eunuchs developed into distinctive art forms that influenced Chinese opera and drama for generations. Their unique vocal qualities, altered by their castration, created sounds that were neither fully masculine nor feminine, perfectly suited to roles that required otherworldly or supernatural characters. These performances were considered among the highest achievements of imperial court culture. But beneath the cultural refinements and philosophical justifications, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. The eunuch system consumed human beings as raw materials for imperial ambition, transforming men into tools through systematic torture that was celebrated as civilization's triumph over barbarism. The beautiful gardens and sublime performances were built upon foundations of screaming flesh, watered with tears that fell in chambers where daylight never penetrated. As night fell over the Forbidden City, as the last tourists departed and darkness reclaimed the ancient stones, the ghosts of 10,000 mutilated men whispered through corridors where their blood had once flowed. Their voices carried across centuries, speaking truths that official histories preferred to forget, reminding anyone willing to listen that human cruelty, when systematized and institutionalized, can achieve levels of horror that individual madness could never match. The eunuch prisons of the Qing Dynasty represent more than historical curiosity or exotic cruelty from a distant past. They reveal the logical endpoint of systems that treat human beings as expendable resources, that justify present suffering through promises of future glory, that transform victims into perpetrators through carefully calibrated trauma. These lessons echo through time with relevance that transcends cultural and historical boundaries, warning us about the human capacity for both suffering and inflicting suffering when power operates without meaningful constraints. The transformation from broken men into imperial servants required more than physical healing and basic training. It demanded the creation of entirely new identities, personalities crafted from the ashes of destroyed masculinity and shaped by the relentless pressure of palace expectations. This psychological reconstruction represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire system, turning victims into willing participants in their own dehumanization. The process began with what administrators called name death, the ceremonial abandonment of birth names that connected eunuchs to their former lives. New identities were assigned based on astrological calculations, imperial whims, or simple administrative convenience. A farmer named Wang Dechang might become Jade Harmony, while a merchant's son called Li Minghua could be transformed into Golden Virtue. These new names weren't just labels, but psychological anchors designed to sever connections to past selves while establishing bonds to palace hierarchy. Master Feng Guangyi, who supervised identity reconstruction during the reign of Emperor Jia Qing, maintained detailed records of this naming process. The selection of appropriate names requires careful consideration of each candidate's psychological profile, he wrote in confidential reports dated 1803. Those who show excessive attachment to their former lives benefit from names that emphasize transformation and rebirth. Candidates who display rebellious tendencies receive names that stress harmony and submission. The goal is not merely to provide new labels, but to plant seeds of new consciousness that will grow over time. Physical appearance underwent equally dramatic transformation, as the newly named eunuchs learned to present themselves according to palace standards. Traditional masculine clothing was forbidden, replaced by robes that emphasized their ambiguous gender status. Hair was styled in elaborate arrangements that took hours to complete and required constant maintenance, ensuring that each eunuch invested significant time and energy in maintaining appearances that reinforced their transformed identity. Cosmetics became mandatory for all palace eunuchs, not for vanity but as visible proof of their separation from ordinary manhood. Face powder whitened skin to aristocratic pallor, while rouge highlighted cheeks in patterns that varied according to rank and assignment. Eyebrows were plucked and redrawn to achieve perfectly symmetrical arches that no natural growth could match. The daily ritual of applying these cosmetics served multiple purposes, consuming time that might otherwise be spent in dangerous reflection while creating visual markers that constantly reminded both wearers and observers of their transformed status. Voice training represented another crucial element of identity reconstruction. The physical changes resulting from castration often affected vocal cords, creating opportunities for eunuchs to develop distinctive speech patterns that emphasize their unique position. Training masters taught them to modulate tone and rhythm in ways that suggested neither aggressive masculinity nor submissive femininity, but something entirely separate from normal gender categories. Chen Yongming, whose survival of the eunuch system allowed him to document these experiences in secret journals hidden for decades, described the psychological impact of voice modification. They taught us to speak as if we were neither pleading nor commanding, but simply existing, he wrote. Our words carried no emotional weight, no hint of desire or ambition that might threaten those we served. We learned to communicate information without revealing opinion, to answer questions without suggesting we possessed independent thought. In losing our natural voices, we lost our ability to express authentic emotion. The curriculum of eunuch education extended far beyond practical skills to include subjects designed to reshape fundamental worldviews. Philosophy classes taught modified versions of Confucian thought that emphasized the virtue of self-sacrifice and the honor of serving one's betters. History lessons focused on examples of eunuchs who had achieved greatness through absolute loyalty, while carefully omitting stories of those who had suffered or rebelled against their fate. Literature studies centered on poetry and prose that celebrated themes of transformation and transcendence, works that presented castration as spiritual purification rather than physical mutilation. Students memorized verses that described the liberation of souls freed from bodily desire, the peace achieved through surrender of masculine pride, the wisdom gained by those who had sacrificed everything for imperial service. Mathematics and accounting skills were taught through problems that reinforced hierarchical thinking. Students calculated tribute payments from subject provinces, computed the costs of imperial ceremonies, and managed budgets for palace maintenance. These exercises served dual purposes, providing practical knowledge while conditioning students to think in terms of service to authority rather than personal advancement. Religious instruction blended elements from Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism to create a synthetic belief system that justified the eunuch condition while providing psychological comfort. Teachers explained how castration freed souls from the cycle of reincarnation by eliminating sexual karma, how physical sacrifice demonstrated spiritual advancement, how service to the emperor constituted worship of divine authority manifested on earth. Medical training formed another essential component of eunuch education, though not for humanitarian reasons. Students learned to recognize and treat conditions common among castrated men, understanding how their altered bodies required different approaches to health maintenance. They studied the effects of hormone imbalances, the management of urinary complications, and the prevention of infections that could prove fatal to men whose immune systems had been compromised by surgical trauma. More significantly, advanced students received instruction in the castration procedures themselves. Senior eunuchs were expected to assist in the production of new candidates, their intimate knowledge of the process making them valuable partners to the professional surgeons who performed the operations. This training created a self-perpetuating cycle where victims became perpetrators, ensuring that the system could continue functioning even if outside support were withdrawn. Liu Baoshan, who rose to become head of surgical training in the 1820s, left disturbing accounts of how these lessons were conducted. New students initially recoil from observing castration procedures, showing natural human revulsion at witnessing such violence, he wrote in training manuals discovered in palace archives. However, repeated exposure combined with careful instruction about technique and necessity gradually transforms this revulsion into professional interest. Within 6 months, most students can assist competently with operations. Within a year, they demonstrate the emotional detachment necessary for independent practice. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this transformation revealed the systematic nature of the dehumanization process. Students were taught to view castration candidates not as fellow human beings, but as raw materials requiring processing. Medical terminology replaced emotional language, creating intellectual distance between operators and subjects. The men being castrated became units requiring modification rather than individuals experiencing trauma. Reward systems within the training program reinforced these attitudes by providing incentives for those who demonstrated appropriate detachment. Students who showed squeamishness or excessive sympathy for castration subjects faced punishment and reduced privileges. Those who displayed professional competence and emotional control received better quarters, superior food, and opportunities for advancement within the palace hierarchy. Graduation ceremonies that marked the completion of eunuch education represented the final stage of psychological transformation. Successful candidates participated in elaborate rituals that celebrated their rebirth as palace servants while symbolically burying their former selves. They swore oaths of eternal loyalty to the emperor and the eunuch system, promising to recruit and train future candidates with the same dedication they had received. These ceremonies included elements designed to eliminate any remaining attachment to their pre-castration identities. Personal possessions from their former lives were burned in ceremonial fires while graduates watched, understanding that they were witnessing the destruction of their past selves. Letters from family members, if any had survived the screening process, were read aloud and then destroyed, severing final connections to the world they had left behind. New graduates received their first official assignments within the palace hierarchy, positions carefully chosen to reinforce their transformed identities while testing their loyalty under pressure. Junior eunuchs might be assigned to cleaning duties in areas where they would encounter evidence of palace decadence and corruption, observing wealth and privilege they could never possess while learning to accept their exclusion without resentment. Others were placed in positions that required them to witness or participate in activities that would have horrified their former selves. They might assist with the punishment of palace servants, help arrange marriages for imperial family members, or manage the sale and purchase of new eunuch candidates. These assignments served as final examinations, testing whether the psychological reconstruction had been successful in creating servants who would perform any duty without moral qualms. The most promising graduates received assignments that placed them in direct contact with imperial family members, positions that offered opportunities for advancement while requiring absolute discretion about what they witnessed. These eunuchs served as personal attendants to emperors and empresses, managing intimate aspects of royal life while maintaining the emotional distance that made such service possible. Promotion within the eunuch hierarchy depended on demonstrated competence in increasingly sensitive assignments. Senior positions required not just technical skills, but sophisticated understanding of palace politics, the ability to navigate complex relationships between competing factions while maintaining absolute loyalty to the imperial system. The most successful eunuchs became power brokers in their own right, wielding influence through their intimate access to imperial decision-makers. Yet, this advancement came at psychological costs that accumulated over decades of service. Senior eunuchs often developed elaborate defense mechanisms to cope with the cognitive dissonance of their positions. Some channeled their frustrated emotions into obsessive pursuit of wealth and status, accumulating possessions and privileges that provided some compensation for what they had lost. Others retreated into scholarly pursuits, finding solace in intellectual achievements that transcended their physical limitations. Many developed complex relationships with the eunuch candidates they helped recruit and train, experiencing parental feelings toward young men whose lives they were helping to destroy. These relationships provided emotional satisfaction while creating internal conflicts that could never be resolved. Senior eunuchs might genuinely care for their protégés while simultaneously preparing them for the same trauma they had experienced. The institutional culture that emerged from these psychological pressures created a unique social environment unlike anything else in Chinese society. Palace eunuchs developed their own language, customs, and traditions that reflected their hybrid status between humanity and utility. They created art forms that expressed emotions they could never acknowledge directly, finding ways to communicate their experiences through coded symbols and references. Eunuch poetry from the Qing period reveals the sophisticated emotional lives these men maintained, despite their institutionalized dehumanization. Their verses spoke of gardens that bloomed without seasons, of music that played without instruments, of love that existed without physical expression. These metaphorical languages allowed them to process their experiences while remaining within boundaries that palace authorities would tolerate. Secret societies emerged within the eunuch community, informal organizations that provided mutual support and protection for members who faced common challenges. These societies operated according to strict codes that emphasized loyalty among eunuchs while maintaining absolute discretion about their activities. They provided insurance against illness or injury, assistance with financial problems, and emotional support during crises that the official palace system ignored. The most secretive of these organizations focused on preserving memories of life before castration, maintaining oral traditions that kept alive stories of families, villages, and experiences that official policy demanded be forgotten. Members would gather in hidden locations to share recollections of childhood, descriptions of parents and siblings, accounts of festivals and celebrations from their former lives. These sessions served as psychological lifelines, connecting isolated individuals to human experiences they could no longer access directly. Intelligence networks operated by senior eunuchs rivaled those maintained by official government agencies in their sophistication and reach. Eunuchs assigned to different parts of the palace shared information about political developments, personal scandals, and administrative changes that might affect their positions. This intelligence gathering served protective purposes, allowing eunuchs to anticipate and prepare for shifts in policy or personnel that could threaten their survival. The economic activities of palace eunuchs created parallel financial systems that operated alongside official imperial treasury functions. Senior eunuchs used their positions to facilitate trade arrangements, currency exchanges, and investment opportunities that generated substantial profits while remaining technically within legal boundaries. These economic networks provided financial security for eunuchs whose official salaries were often inadequate for their needs. Retirement policies for aging eunuchs reflected the systematic nature of their exploitation throughout their careers. Men who had served faithfully for decades found themselves pensioned off to remote facilities where they lived in poverty, while their former positions were filled by younger candidates. These retirement homes resembled warehouses for damaged human beings, places where the empire stored men who had outlived their usefulness, while avoiding the expense of proper care. Some fortunate eunuchs accumulated enough wealth during their careers to purchase comfortable retirements in private facilities or even independent households. These success stories were publicized by palace administrators as examples of the rewards available to loyal servants, though they represented exceptional cases rather than typical outcomes for most eunuchs. The death rituals surrounding deceased eunuchs revealed the continuing ambiguity of their status, even in their final moments. Palace protocol specified elaborate funeral ceremonies for senior eunuchs, recognizing their contributions to imperial service while maintaining distinctions that separated them from normal human beings even in death. Their preserved genitalia were indeed buried with them, fulfilling promises made during their castration that they would be made whole again in the afterlife. Mass graves for junior eunuchs who died in service contained hundreds of bodies buried without individual markers or ceremonies. These men had served their purpose and were disposed of with the same efficiency that had characterized their training and utilization. Their remains joined thousands of others in anonymous burial grounds that surrounded the capital, evidence of a system that had consumed human lives on an industrial scale. Medical records from palace physicians documented the long-term health consequences of systematic castration with a clinical precision that revealed both the scope of the suffering and the indifference of those who documented it. Eunuchs experienced higher rates of bone disease, cardiovascular problems, and psychological disorders than the general population. Their altered hormone levels created complex health challenges that required ongoing medical attention throughout their lives. Mental health issues among palace eunuchs included conditions that modern psychology would recognize as severe trauma responses, though 18th century medicine had no framework for understanding or treating such problems. Depression, anxiety, and dissociative disorders were common among eunuchs, often manifesting in ways that disrupted palace operations and required administrative responses. Suicide rates among palace eunuchs significantly exceeded those in the general population, despite official policies that attempted to prevent such deaths through surveillance and intervention. The psychological pressures of their existence, combined with the hopelessness of their situation, drove many men to seek the only escape they could control. Palace records carefully documented these deaths while avoiding analysis of their underlying causes. The international reputation of Chinese eunuch systems attracted visitors from across Asia and beyond, scholars and officials who sought to understand and potentially replicate these methods of human control. Korean, Japanese, and Southeast Asian delegations toured palace facilities, observing castration procedures and training methods that they might adapt for their own purposes. European visitors during the late Qing period expressed fascination and horror at the systematic nature of eunuch production, documenting their observations in journals and official reports that circulated throughout Western diplomatic circles. These accounts influenced European understanding of Chinese civilization, contributing to stereotypes about Oriental despotism and cruelty that persisted for generations. The technological innovations developed to support eunuch systems included surgical instruments, medical techniques, and administrative procedures that found applications beyond their original purposes. Chinese achievements in surgical precision, infection control, and large-scale human processing influenced medical practice throughout East Asia, while demonstrating the potential for systematic application of violence to human bodies. As the Qing Dynasty entered its final decades, the eunuch system faced challenges from modernizing forces that questioned traditional methods of governance and social control. Reform movements criticized the institution as backward and inhumane, while practical considerations about efficiency and cost-effectiveness made alternative approaches increasingly attractive to imperial administrators. Western influence and Christian missionary activity created new moral frameworks that challenged the philosophical justifications for systematic castration. Foreign observers who had initially been fascinated by the exotic cruelty of eunuch systems began advocating for their abolition as China engaged more extensively with international communities that condemned such practices. The gradual decline of the eunuch system occurred alongside broader transformations in Chinese society, as traditional institutions gave way to modern approaches to governance and social organization. The last castrations performed for imperial service took place in the early 20th century, marking the end of a tradition that had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives over more than 2 millennia. Yet the psychological and cultural legacies of the eunuch system persisted long after its formal abolition, influencing Chinese attitudes toward authority, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual welfare and state power. The institutional memory of systematic dehumanization continued to shape social relationships and political structures throughout the transition to modern China. The physical spaces where these transformations had occurred remained embedded in the architecture of the Forbidden City, chambers and corridors that had witnessed unspeakable suffering while serving the glory of imperial power. Tourists who visit these spaces today walk unknowingly through rooms where thousands of men had been systematically mutilated, their blood absorbed into stones that still echo with screams from centuries past. The records and artifacts that survive provide fragmentary evidence of lives lived in systematic horror, documents that reveal both the bureaucratic efficiency of institutionalized cruelty and the resilience of human spirits subjected to unimaginable pressure. These materials remind us that behind every administrative statistic lay individual human beings who experienced fear, pain, hope, and despair with the same intensity as any other person in any other historical circumstance. The eunuch prisons of the Qing Dynasty stand as monuments to humanity's capacity for creating systems that transform victims into perpetrators while maintaining the appearance of civilization and progress. They demonstrate how institutional structures can normalize the most extreme forms of violence while convincing both practitioners and victims that such suffering serves necessary and even noble purposes. In the shadows of marble pillars and beneath painted ceilings that celebrated imperial glory, 10,000 ghosts continue their eternal vigil, bearing witness to truths that official histories preferred to minimize or ignore entirely. Their voices speak across centuries with messages that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries, reminding us that the price of unchecked power is always paid by those who possess no power to resist its demands. The morning sun rises over Beijing as it has for countless centuries, illuminating ancient stones that remember everything while revealing nothing to casual observers. But for those willing to listen, the whispers continue, carrying stories of men who paid the ultimate price for serving systems that viewed human beings as expendable resources in the grand projects of empire and authority. The final act of eunuch transformation involved what palace administrators euphemistically called the presentation ceremony, a ritualized display that demonstrated the complete success of their systematic reconstruction project. Each newly graduated eunuch was required to appear before a panel of senior palace officials, presenting themselves as living proof that human nature itself could be reshaped according to imperial specifications. These presentations followed carefully choreographed scripts designed to showcase the psychological metamorphosis that had accompanied physical mutilation. Candidates demonstrated their mastery of palace etiquette, their understanding of hierarchical relationships, and most importantly, their emotional detachment from their former identities. They spoke about their gratitude for the opportunity to serve, their acceptance of their transformed condition, and their eagerness to contribute to the imperial system that had remade them. Master Zhou Tianming, who supervised these ceremonies during the 1780s, maintained detailed evaluations of each candidate's performance. The most successful presentations involve complete emotional disconnection from past identity. He noted in confidential assessments, candidates who still show traces of grief or resentment require additional conditioning before assignment to sensitive positions. Those who demonstrate genuine enthusiasm for their transformation represent ideal outcomes of our reconstruction process. The psychological mechanisms that enabled these performances revealed the sophisticated nature of the brainwashing techniques employed throughout the system. Candidates learned to internalize the narratives that had been imposed upon them, genuinely believing that their suffering had meaning and purpose beyond mere survival. They developed elaborate justifications for their condition that transformed trauma into triumph, victimization into voluntary sacrifice. The stone corridors of the Forbidden City still echo with the whispers of those who paid the ultimate price for imperial ambition. In these chambers where manhood was currency and human dignity was systematically dismantled, we witness the terrifying efficiency of power unchecked by conscience. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty, but calculated systems that transformed victims into perpetrators, ensuring their own perpetuation through carefully calibrated trauma. The eunuch prisons reveal humanity's darkest capacity for institutionalizing suffering, while celebrating it as civilization's greatest achievement. Their ghosts remind us that when we surrender our humanity to serve power, we risk becoming the very monsters we claim to oppose.